Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Jewish People Policy Institute's Inside Analysis of Israel at War. Today, I'm honored to be joined by our two senior fellows, Gil Troy and retired Colonel Eldar Zilber, both who will be with us to discuss the ongoing war with Hamas, some of their feelings, thoughts, and personal experiences as we've been through this. Eldar, in particular, has been serving quite a few days in the reserves. So we'll hear from him what that experience is like, being a soldier, but also being a father and a husband and having a day job that you're pulled away from to participate in Israel's war against Hamas. Before that, I had a conversation earlier today with Rabbi Dr. Shlomo Brody, who is the executive director of an organization called Ematai, but came out with a fantastic book recently called The Ethics of Our Fighters. And it is about morality of warfare and the conduct of Jews and how they have viewed war throughout the millennia and centuries, and looking back at Jewish literature and Jewish thought and Jewish halakha, and what there is said there about how Israel is meant, or how Jews are meant to fight. And the book obviously just came out just a few days ago, so it obviously does not pertain and does not talk about the ongoing conflict, but there's a lot of lessons from that book, from the book, that can be applied, as we'll hear from Dr. Brody, that can be applied to the current ongoing conflict with Hamas. So before we go to Gil and Eldar, here is Rabbi Dr. Shlomo Brody talking about his new book, The Ethics of Our Fighters. Rabbi Dr. Shlomo Brody, it's great to have you with us on the JPPI webinar and podcast. Thanks so much for joining us. So I was looking at your new book, and congratulations to all of our viewers and listeners. You'll want to check out Ethics of Our Fighters, a Jewish view on war and morality, that just came out this week, recently published off the presses by Koren Publishing. So congratulations on the book. And I know that it wasn't written with the October 7th attacks and the war that has ensued necessarily in mind, and I want to talk about that. But first, why don't you just give us a brief overview of what is the book about? Why did you feel compelled to write this book? And then I want to dive in with you to talk a bit about the application of what you researched and learned and wrote to everything that's happening right now. So why this book?
Thanks so much, Yaakov. I've always been interested in the intersection between Jewish thought and ethics and how those play out. And when it comes to the history of Zionism, it's always been a really interesting question when Jews who didn't have the struggles and the dilemmas of sovereignty for hundreds, thousands of years, really, all of a sudden now have to deal with these issues, ethical issues of power and warfare. How are we going to address those issues? And what does Judaism have to say about it? So I sort of set out to systematically write a book that would talk about the history of these dilemmas and how Jews confronted it, with in mind, in particular, where Judaism might come and play and how that might inform our decisions. Issues of military ethics and power. There's a lot of discussion about this in Christian literature. They had power, so they had these issues to deal with. Jews didn't have this, and so really starting with World War I, we started to confront these issues again, and certainly as Zionism progressed. And I wanted to tell that story of how we confronted these issues and the lessons we can learn from it. And what I found was really fascinating is that many early Zionists, religious or not religious, sometimes anti-religious, were still very interested in what Judaism or the sources of Judaism or the history of Judaism might teach us about these dilemmas. And that's sort of what I try to set out and write the book about.
So if I understand, and just skimming, there's two basic rough time periods to an extent, or two states of mind almost, for the Jew. One is the powerless Jew, the Jew who's living in exile, who's subservient to another nation's laws and army to give it some sort of protection, or not, or to kill it, as happened so many times throughout history. But then there's the history of the Jews after 1948 and the establishment of the State of Israel. Now Jews have the power, the ability to defend themselves by themselves. So I'm guessing that the ethics also changed to some extent, like what Jewish literature, law, or halacha, how it would have looked at. I know one of the examples is like the bombings of Dresden, let's say. I'm curious, like that might be different than the way we're looking today at the bombings of Gaza, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting. When I spoke to one of your colleagues actually at the JPPI, Shuki Friedman, and I told him I was writing this book. He goes to me, "That's going to be a very short book. What does Judaism have to say about this issue?" And Shuki's got great respect, of course, for the Jewish tradition. But we do see some discussion about these dilemmas in medieval and earlier literature. Of course, in the Bible, there's a lot of warfare and descriptions of it. But then the question becomes is, well, do you really want to look to those sources, right? How ethical were those stories in the Bible, and how much could they teach us in medieval period when they didn't have much to say about these issues because it wasn't so relevant? So in some ways, we're starting anew in the 20th century, but there are passages in earlier rabbinic literature that are insightful and that certainly were part of what guided Jews in the 20th century and Zionists. But part of also what guided people was understanding Jewish history and what had happened to us because of powerlessness. And on the one hand, we didn't want to act like those who had acted ruthlessly against us. It's a very important trait that many Jews and early Zionists stressed, is don't do what others did to us. And that's one of those lessons of Jewish history. The other great lesson of Jewish history, though, is if you don't know how to fight and protect yourself and do what it takes to protect yourself, you're going to die. And those are two, tensions or two dilemmas or values, that are in a bit of a tension with each other. And I think that's part of the story that I try to tell is how these great thinkers and leaders balanced those two values.
So, as you're speaking, I'm thinking Chaya, my wife, likes to tell the story after the October 7th attacks, that for many years I would say to her on Shabbat Zachor, right, the Shabbat that we Jews read the story of Amalek and remind ourselves to never forget what Amalek did to us. And there's that commandment in the Torah of how to fight and to destroy basically all of Amalek. I would say, and it's always right around Purim, right, the Shabbat before Purim or around that time. I would always say, I can't believe that we have this. This is such a terrible, and I could personally just never come to terms with this commandment of Amalek. And I know so much has been written about it, so much. After October 7th, I said to her one day, I now feel like I begin to understand it in a more real way personally, right? And I'm sure that's also a tension that exists to a large extent in what you were grappling with in this book.
Oh, absolutely. And if you saw the cover of Commentary magazine after October 7th, they quote the biblical verses, which says, "Remember what Amalek has done to you." And there's something very powerful about that passage in the Bible, which teaches us the importance of uprooting evil, of recognizing evil and uprooting evil. And that's an important principle of ethics that should drive us. There's an ethical imperative to get rid of evil from the world, particularly, of course, when it's threatening you in such a severe manner. At the same time, I don't think any of us want to go back to indiscriminately killing, men, women, and children, whether a threat to us or not, and have any interest in genocide, as the biblical commandment seems to ordain. And that's something that we have to deal with when we think about, well, what does our tradition teach us? And in fact, one of the things that I try to develop in chapter 2 of the book in particular is precisely relating to that type of legacy, which says that we know we have to get rid of evil, but that doesn't mean we can do everything to accomplish that goal. And so that is part of the challenge we have. And by the way, it was a similar challenge that people had in the late 30s. Zionists were debating, right? What were we going to do in order to get this state, to get the British to give us sovereignty when we saw the clouds of war hanging over Europe, right? Would you randomly kill an Arab, right? Terror against terror, right? Commit our own terror attacks, which is more or less what the Etzel was doing at the time. Or would you say that's an abominable act? You can't do that. So these were real dilemmas that we had to deal with. And I think that history and the story of those dilemmas is really important for us to understand.
It's very interesting. And what you said also makes me think that, you have an obligation to uproot evil, just compounds the failures of October 7th, or what led up to October 7th, is that we can all talk about the intelligence failure and how we knew that Hamas was there. But I always think to the fact that, basically Hamas was telling us, we're going to kill you. We're going to rape your women and kidnap your children. And we kept on saying, no, you're just kidding. Or you just want to vent. But we didn't, we were playing a diplomatic political game. We weren't seizing the ethical imperative as you're referring to it.
Absolutely. And there's a real interesting ethical dilemma, which is, when do you preemptively attack? Right? When do you say there's too much of a threat here? I cannot bear to deal with this threat, right? To let them come to us first. I've got to go and attack and take it to them, which is something which the world has a hard time accepting, particularly, by the way, after Iraq and Afghanistan, right, where you could argue were preventative wars, depending on your stand-in, and didn't necessarily work out the way we wanted them to work out. And that's a real ethical dilemma, which is you have this obligation to protect your own people. Yeah. And we should, and that was the great ethical failure of October 7th. It wasn't just a strategic failure. It's an ethical failure, which says we have this obligation to protect our people. And we failed at that. And one of the things we're going to have to think about after the war, of course, right? But we're going to have to think about this after the war is, well, should we have done something preemptively, or should we have done something, even though we weren't sure maybe that they were going to do this? And the truth is, it's not something we may have the luxury of thinking about after the war, because as you know well, Yaakov, we do have Iran to deal with. We have Hezbollah to deal with. We've got like 6 fronts right now.
Yeah.
And the question becomes is, well, do we have a strategic or an ethical obligation to sort of take the fight to them at this stage?
It's very interesting. So I want to move with you, Shlomo, to the application of everything that you write about in this book and what you're seeing right now happen over the last 80 days or so, fighting in Gaza. There's a lot of questions, right? People look, I hate the numbers game, but the numbers game is part of this. People say, okay, you got 21,000 Palestinians killed. Israel says, well, we're not even sure about those numbers, but we believe 6,000 to 7,000 of them are Hamas or Islamic Jihad fighters. So we're looking at a 1-to-2 ratio, 1 combatant, 2 civilians. And I think if you do look overall throughout the recent modern warfare history, that's not so bad. In terms of that ratio, it's actually quite good. But that's not a conversation that you can really have with people who aren't willing to think and be open-minded and actually use their brain muscles. But I'm curious, when you look at the war, is Israel fighting ethically? Is Israel doing everything it can? Is Israel upholding the standards that were laid out in centuries of Jewish thought and literature?
Based on what we know, the access that we have, right, in terms of what's being reported, I think Israel's doing an incredible job. And the numbers that you mentioned beforehand are really, they're very low in terms of the number of non-combatants that have been killed. Now, of course, it's really hard to know exactly who's a combatant, who's a non-combatant when you're dealing with a terrorist group and asymmetric warfare. But the biggest issue we're dealing with is we're fighting an army that's underground, or that's staying underground. I mean, how many precedents do you have for this in the history of warfare? And we're fighting a situation where, for various reasons, the bordering countries, in this case, Egypt, won't allow refugees to come through their borders. So, at some point, one of these questions you really have to be thinking about is, who bears responsibility for these non-combatant deaths, which we should say from the get-go are tragic. It is absolutely tragic because we believe that all human beings are created in the image of God and have a certain amount of inherent dignity. We don't want to see non-combatants, and certainly young children and whatnot, we don't want to see them killed. It's a terrible phenomenon. But responsibility for that has to lie with those who aren't doing anything to protect them. And in this case, that's really with Hamas. And it's a super hard argument to make against TikTok and Instagram and pictures on Al Jazeera and CNN. And we have to build up the moral fortitude to understand that this remains ethical. And that's part of why I wrote this book, is to explain to people, you cannot judge the ethics of the scene based on gruesome pictures.
Or based on a snip, an Instagram, what are they called? Reel or whatever those things are. The other question I have, Israel is, we like to say about ourselves that we are the most moral army in the world, right? That's like a known kind of slogan. And a lot of people say that's not necessarily the case. Look at the way the military operates. They'll throw out, an image here or a video. Now, of course, there are rotten weeds in every society. But I'm curious, in the comparative analysis that you did writing this book, and in what you researched and discovered in the historical analysis as well. Does that slogan, does that phrase really hold up? Are we the most moral army? And is it because of, sorry, let me just add one more point to it. Is it because of our Jewish tradition?
So I think it's absolutely true that Israel has been fighting moral wars. And we have to understand what I mean by that. It's fighting that it's just in going to war, and it's fighting in a just manner. And part of the real issue is that people don't understand that distinction between the ethics of deciding to go to war, is this justified to go to war in the first place, and how you fight war once war has begun. And the reason why that gets so confusing for people is there are many people, including Israelis, who are sympathetic to the larger Palestinian claim or Palestinian nationalism. Right? And so when they see all these people being killed in Gaza, and they feel like, well, shouldn't they have a state? Maybe they should have a state. Why don't they have a state? And so they combine those two factors. But you really have to separate those out, because there's one question was Israel justified to fight on October 8th? I think everyone understands here the answer is yes. Well, if that's the case, then the next question is, once they're deciding to fight, are they fighting in a way which is trying to remove the threat, which is an ethical imperative to remove this threat against their people, and at the same time trying to minimize non-combatant deaths in a very, very difficult battlefield situation? And I think here it's crucially important to understand that since 82, in the first Lebanon war, Israel's been dealing with this issue. And you asked me about the impact of Jewish tradition. So there's an amazing story, which I tell in the book. In 82, Israel, month into the war, lays siege on Beirut. It's a big moment. And the Ashkenazic chief rabbi of Israel, who has a military history, Rabbi Shlomo Goren, gets up and announces publicly, Israel must create an evacuation corridor. Jewish law mandates allowing people to leave a siege. And the IDF does that. And 100,000 people flee Beirut. And so, that's a big deal. Now, I don't know it's just because Rabbi Goren said it, right? There are other reasons why, of course, we did it. But I think that's a great example of how the Jewish tradition is going to try to balance values. And ultimately, that's the biggest difficulty that people have today is you see these images and you just say, this is horrible. It must stop. It sounds like that's, by the way, what the Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau was saying. I saw these images. This cannot be, right? Something which is permissible. But the answer is that the complex moral life is always going to be balancing different types of moral imperatives. And we have a moral imperative right now to remove evil and protect our people. This isn't about revenge. That's very important. And unfortunately, our defense minister used a little bit of those terminology in the first week. Terrible mistake. And we shouldn't think about it in terms of vengeance. And it's not even about justice per se. This is about self-defense and protecting the future ability of Jews to live in this land.
And I like the added, it's an ethical responsibility also, right? That you have as a country and as a military towards your people.
Absolutely, because the way this gets presented is there's a humanitarian argument as opposed to interest. Well, it's not just an interest of Israel to have safe borders, right? This is an ethical imperative to protect our people. And by the way, ethical imperatives might sometimes, dictate to retreat from territory, right? To give up land for peace, wherever it might be. And that's one of the issues I get into in the book as well, is that the whole land for peace issue isn't just a matter of interest and power versus humanitarianism or something like that. And this is a much larger and broader question, which is really a deep ethical issue in terms of evaluating what's best for your defense and how you preserve life.
Yeah. Well, I couldn't think of a more important time to have this discussion and for the book, Ethics of Our Fighters, to come out. I want to thank you very much, Rabbi Dr. Shlomo Brody, for being with us. And people, get this book if you want to understand what's going on and how Israel fights, and the foundation, the value foundation upon which the IDF operates. So thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks so much, Yaakov.
So I thought that was a very interesting conversation. What I actually took away from it, and now I do have to read the book, is that I like this idea that a state, when you think about like October 7th, and you think about all the failures, and we think about what the responsibility is of a government towards its people, but this whole ethical responsibility of what it means to defend your country and to eliminate threats and to uproot evil, and that being like this kind of ancient Jewish foundational principle of sorts, is something that's very interesting. But I want to go to our two panelists here, and I know that both of you probably have a lot to say specifically on this topic, and I want to start with Eldar. So Eldar, I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts, just so our listeners, maybe just a quick one word of who Eldar is. It's good to have him for the first time on the podcast. And on the webinar, Eldar is a former officer in the Israeli Air Force, is now currently doing a lot of reserves, runs a lot of the data. There's a whole data information program, the Glazer Center, I think it's called, at JPPI. So a lot of work on that. Has done some intelligence work in the Air Force, and is now spending a lot of time as I mentioned, in the reserves. But Eldar, I'd love to hear your thoughts specifically about kind of this whole ethical warfare conversation.
Hi everyone, hi Yaakov and Gil. I'm very happy to be here. I must tell you that I think that I live in two worlds. The first world is the world that when I put on my uniform and go to the army. And then I living in a territory that I understand, and I must tell you that now after almost 90 days that there is no such a thing as ethical issue, because in each target, in each place, in each thing that we are doing, we are looking about everything. We are trying to understand if there is something that can be with the, not something, sorry, that a place with the human, with kids, with the unrelated people and something like this. But on the other hand, I understand that the best way in my position is, guys, it's a war, let's bomb everything. But no, this is not how we are working, and it's amazing. Sometimes there is a critical target that we know that we must bomb right away. And if we want to bomb it right away, we will miss a very important person that can change the whole face of the war. But no, we are checking, we are working, we try to understand. There is a mosque or a school or hospital near the area. There is a short possible of damage that we can do. We are checking everything. And after we are doing all the check, we need to approve again and to make sure that there is another eye that checking us, and then we can move. This is my world on the last 90 days to make sure that everything is okay. Now we are looking also on, on the social network, Instagram, everything, and we saw all the things that the other side is saying.
Saying about what you're doing, exactly.
Exactly. So we are looking at reports like there is like 100 dead on the hospital. We know for sure that there is nothing like this, but we are taking it as a fact, and we are going to check to see again if there was any mistake. We are looking from upstairs, downstairs, from everything to make sure that we did the right thing. And I must tell you that I think most of the time and most of the reports that I was handling, there was a big lie from the other side. And then I'm going out, take off my universe, and coming to the real world. And then there is, something like 100 degrees, 180 degrees, the opposite. Everything looks like the most horrified thing in the world. You just said that there is like over than 20,000 people that was killed. I don't think that there is one person except in the army or from the reporters that know exactly what are the numbers of the soldiers, of the Hamas soldiers or the jihad soldiers that was killed.
Right.
We know the numbers, we understand exactly the numbers, and we know that there is sometimes other casualties because this is the situation. But if you know, and I think that everyone knows that we are telling, we are asking, the spokesman of the IDF every day ask all the people to move to Rafiah, to other areas, in order to make sure that they won't be injured. If they decide to stay, it's causing us a lot of trouble, I must tell you. But we are taking it under consideration, and the situation is very unique, challenging, but I
Right.
think that our IDF is amazing the way he is doing.
So Eldar, I want playing off of that, Gil, I want to go to you because you kind of look at this, and I know that you grapple with this on the other side to a large extent, right? The people who are disseminating and the people who are spreading these lies or the false information and trying to counter it in a different way. And I'm sure you, like I, have used many times over the years in lectures and articles and op-eds, have the most moral army in the world, and spoken to what Eldar is explaining that he's actually dealing with. Like he gets his hands dirty with this stuff. I mean, it's an uphill battle to a large extent, no?
So first of all, I just have to honor Eldar because you're really dealing with the most difficult dilemmas. And as Rabbi Shlomo Brody said, you really have the fate of our kids, of our future in your hands. And we so appreciate what you and all your colleagues do. I'm torn, I have to say, as an American historian who's studied World War II in depth, who watched the Iraq War. I often think that morality in war is like vegetarianism among cannibals. It's an oxymoron. And I notice how the American people, I'm not just talking about the American military and the American leadership, I'm talking the American people basically choose not to look too closely, choose not to scrutinize. And it's fascinating to me and quite depressing to me how much scrutiny Israel is under, how it is under the gun, how it is under the microscope when, and I'm not talking about 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 70 years ago. I'm talking about during the Iraq War, during the Afghanistan War. I'm talking about 677,000 people dying in Syria. The American people and the universities were silent. So the American historian in me is very, very skeptical about and cynical about this whole conversation. The Zionist in me is so proud about this struggle because we have to live in the real world, but we always, always, always are dreamers. And we always, always, always are trying to hold our souls together and keep the dream alive. And that part of the dream is not just being a free people in our homeland, but living up to our highest ideals. And that's also where Rabbi Brody's conversation is so important, and going back to those Jewish roots while also living in the real world. And we know how easy it was for us to be moral when we were lambs being led to the slaughter.
Right.
And being moral when you have evil enemies. I don't hear much of a conversation among Hamas or among the pro-Palestinian demonstrators at Harvard and Yale and Rutgers and Princeton about the morality of October 7th. So asymmetrical warfare is not only the limitations that are imposed on us in real time, and Eldar, I'm sure, could tell us stories of important targets that sometimes were not taken out and ultimately hurt us years later or months later because of our morality. But the disproportion of all the moral wincing and cringing about what we do and the free pass that Hamas gets. And that's frankly a form of bigotry against Hamas and against the Arabs and against Palestinians. And I hold them to the same standards because, as Rabbi Shlomo Brody said, it's about human beings. Every human being is precious. My people are precious and their people are precious. But one more thing I have to say, as the father of IDF soldiers, I am so appreciative of our ethical code, because one of the things I worry about, I don't only worry about people coming home fully in bodies, I worry about their souls. And the fact that my kids all know that there are red lines that we won't cross, the fact that my kids know that they are doing the most unspeakable, dirty things that I've never had to do in my life, and yet have that sense of morality, gives this whole thing a clarity. And when they come home and start healing emotionally and psychically, and we all start healing emotionally and psychically, those red lines will be so important. So I'm not doing it to be popular. And I have a healthy appreciation, Yaakov, as you do, of the fact that no matter what we do, once we start defending ourselves, when we're bleeding, we're popular. Once we start defeating ourselves, it's too much. It's not going to get as popular. but I think about internally how we have to protect our souls and our psyches.
There was a chief of staff, Moshe Ya'alon, back in the early 2000s, who referred to this as the mirror test. Can he stand in front of a mirror and look himself in the mirror and be able to live with what he's able to do? And that's how he would, back, if we all remember, in the early 2000s, as the beginning of the Second Intifada, when targeted killings became one of the tactics that Israel was employing quite often. That was he was using the mirror test a lot. Eldar, I want to go back to you, and I want to make it a little personal, if you don't mind, because I think that you have a very important personal story that I can only imagine has been with you and on your mind for these last 80-something days. Please, if you don't mind sharing with us what and you know what I'm referring to.
Yeah. So I will take you all back 50 years ago. I was born on August 1973. And when I was 8 weeks old, my father was killed on Yom Kippur War. I didn't manage to know him. I know him from videos, pictures, stories. But until I was 18, the Yom Kippur ceremony, the Independence Day, I wasn't at school. I was at the ceremony, saying Kaddish and praying on my father with all my family. And when I was young, I remember that I asked my mother why I can't be with all my friends on school. And she told me we have something else to do. And when I was 18 and I wanted to be in the army, there was the huge question of am I going to be a Krovi or I'm going to do something else? My mother, I comment. My mother told me that I can do whatever I want to do, and I started to do some tests, and then I found myself in the intelligence section of the Air Force, and it was fine with me, and this is something that for me was something great. And then the years passed, and we entered the October War. The October War on the 7th of October found me on vacation on the other place, at the other side of the world, near Africa. And it took me like a few hours to understand that there is here a huge situation. And then I started to think how I'm going back to Israel. It was very difficult. And I managed to go back on Israel on the 9th of October and to start my service. The 9th of October, 2023 was the day that my father was killed. And this is like was a huge circle for me to understand that there is only one thing for me to do, to fight on my country and to make sure that we will do everything to win and to make sure that we are going to live here. The last 90 days are very difficult. You say it, you told it at the beginning. I'm on the army. There is like my new job or my old job is now came back to me. All my neighbors look at me and say, you go back to the army. It's very obvious for them. But for me, it's not so obvious because after I got retired, there is like a whole life that everyone knows, but I didn't know, and I started to live. Family, wife, work, regular stuff, I think. And 1 hour, one thing, everything was like wrapped away. We closed it, and we started to do things that are very important. I wish I will be able to tell you, but it's a bit classified. But the issues that I think everyone need to understand that as a reserve, you have your family, you have your job, but you have your duty. And this is something that I can't tell you how amazing with all my friends. There is like, I think over 300,000 reserves people now in the war. There is a lot of them that are 40 and more. And we are speaking together, and everyone put their job aside put their family aside. On the last 90 days, I didn't manage to have a full weekend with my family. It's a dream right now to be like more than 10 hours after I will sleep and rest a bit with the kids and everything. It's impossible because you are thinking of the next day, what you're going to do, your shipment, whatever, and everyone is calling you because the experience that we are bringing to this war, it's amazing. And all the people who are now serving need this experience and they are speaking with us. So we are, it's amazing from one side to understand that you have the opportunity to do something huge, but it's also very, very difficult. But this is the life in Israel, and I think that we are used to it and we have to do it, and therefore we are here.
And what an amazing story. And I'm thinking, Gil, that it's like this cycle that we sometimes feel in this country of, Eldar said it so, October 9th, you come back, you put on your uniform, you go fight, and that's 50 years to the day. And also the surprise, right? The shock of Yom Kippur War, the shock of October 7th attacks. It all together is just like, it says something about what we face as a country.
Absolutely. First of all, as I'm hearing this moving story, I'm thinking of that popular song from the 1990s, which our friend Danny Gordis just spread around on his Substack, if I'm allowed to mention somebody else's Substack. We are the children of October 73. And 3 teachers updated the song and changed the words to basically say how much we honor you, our students. You are the heroes of October 2023. And so there's a certain feeling of the circle continuing. I also, as I'm listening to Eldar, I'm just thinking, how dare anybody sit there in the comfort of their home, not here, and lecture us about morality in wartime? How dare anybody tell us that we don't appreciate the power of loss? 50 years later, we're still mourning his father. And 50 years from now, we'll still be mourning his father. And the notion that we're these primitive beasts who somehow don't feel, that we're these, that we're not as sophisticated and as enlightened as some of our other fellow Jews who have the luxury of judging us by remote control, is very, very painful and very, very hurtful. And I'm hoping that as part of one of the many resets we need to have in this war is we'll have a new conversation, both among our Jewish brothers and sisters all over the world and among our fellow liberal Democrats all over the world. It's so easy to judge one another. It's so easy to finger point. But really, we know the true morality comes from walking in the other shoes and understanding the challenges of October 7th, the challenges of being surrounded. Shlomo Brody mentioned this briefly, but we should emphasize a 7-front war that includes the territories, the West Bank, whatever you want to call it, that includes Hezbollah. By what right does Hezbollah just start attacking us? By the way, I'm joining my university colleagues. I'm yelling ceasefire too. I'm yelling ceasefire to Hezbollah. I'm yelling ceasefire to the Houthis. I'm yelling ceasefire to the Iranians. So I think we just need to have a new reset where we, first of all, talk about Israel in real terms, in respectful terms. And I've always said I don't want special treatment as for Israel or as a Jew. I just want equal treatment. And that's not what's happening, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's all very interesting. And what I think about is how all those people, like you said, Gil, who attack us and criticize us today and say that we're not being moral or we're not being ethical in the way that we're fighting, but thinking back 50 years ago, how then we were also fighting for existence. And today, 50 years later, we still have to fight for existence. It says something more about the other side than about us. We're just trying to live our lives. They just want to keep on attacking us. And thankfully, we do have people like Eldar who are willing to fly back within 48 hours from their vacation somewhere in Africa and put back on that uniform to fight alongside those 18-year-olds and everyone else and to keep this country safe. So on that note, I want to thank Eldar, I want to thank Gil, I want to thank Rabbi Brody, and I want to thank all our viewers and listeners for being with us. I want to wish everyone a Shabbat Shalom. I think we will probably not meet before the new year, where our next episode is on Monday. So I want to wish everyone also a happy new year. Let's hope that the coming new year will be one that will be a bit quieter than 2023 from that perspective. So thank you very much, and Shabbat